My clearance level was designed to shield me from learning too much. It didn't. The information I inadvertently uncovered at Archuleta Mesa in 1979 was never intended for someone with my level of clearance. This briefing lasted precisely 3 minutes. The threats began years ago, but silence has a limited shelf life, and mine has already expired. If you're watching this video, you understand that we bring you the true tales of active and former members of the military. They are tales of bravery, of sacrifice, and the mysteries that arise during the service of our great nation. The story for today comes from a location which very few people have ever had the chance to discuss. Don't forget to like and turn the notifications on as we upload a daily video. My name is David Carlson. In the summer of '79, I was 32 years old, recently discharged from the Army Corps of Engineers with an honorable discharge and a skill set the private sector found valuable. I'd spent 8 years working on classified construction projects, bunkers, communications facilities, the kind of infrastructure that doesn't appear on any map, when a security firm out of Albuquerque offered me a contract position on what they called a sensitive geological survey project. I didn't ask too many questions. The pay was triple my Army salary. The benefits included a non-disclosure agreement thicker than my service record. They told me I'd be working near Dulce, a small town on Jicarilla Apache land in northern New Mexico. Population barely cracked 3,000, the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where the landscape stretches endless in every direction, and where the night sky opens up like a doorway to somewhere else. Beautiful country. Isolated. Perfect for secrets. The first week was routine on the surface. Below it, tensions ran high from day one. We set up a base camp 5 miles outside of town, a collection of prefabricated buildings and equipment trailers that appeared overnight like metal mushrooms in the desert. There were maybe 40 of us initially, security contractors, engineers, geologists, and a handful of civilians whose job titles were deliberately vague. Logistics coordinator, technical consultant, field researcher. Words that meant everything and nothing. The camp itself felt temporary and permanent at the same time. The buildings had that manufactured quality you see in military installations worldwide. Interchangeable, functional, designed to be assembled and disassembled in hours. But the infrastructure beneath them suggested a longer stay. Power cables buried 3 feet deep, water lines connected to underground tanks, communications equipment that wouldn't make sense for a short-term geological survey. My bunk was in Trailer 3, a space I shared with 2 other engineers, Carl Richmond from Denver and Tom Sullivan from Seattle. Carl was maybe 50, gray-haired, quiet, the kind of guy who kept his head down and cashed his checks without asking questions. Tom was younger, late 20s, fresh out of graduate school with a degree in geological engineering and enough enthusiasm to make the rest of us feel ancient. He asked questions constantly those first few days. Why were there armed guards? Why couldn't we make personal phone calls? Why did our badges need biometric scanners for a geological survey? Nobody had good answers. Or nobody wanted to share the answers they had. The project supervisor, a man named Frank Dalton, was former Air Force. You could tell from the way he carried himself, back straight, movements economical, eyes that cataloged everything and gave away nothing. He had that particular brand of authority that comes from years of working in classified environments. When Frank told you to do something, you did it. When Frank told you to forget something, you tried. He held briefings every morning at 0700 sharp. Status updates, task assignments, weather reports, everything structured, documented, predictable. Everything except the information that actually mattered. The guards bothered me most. Not that they existed. Security made sense on paper. We were on native land, handling expensive equipment, working with sensitive geological data. But there were too many of them. 12-hour rotations, armed with M16 rifles, patrolling a perimeter that seemed to expand every few days. On day 3, I watched them install motion sensors along the fence line, industrial-grade equipment, the kind you'd use to detect a person trying to breach a military installation, not a cow wandering off tribal land. Tom noticed it too. We were calibrating seismic equipment together when he leaned in close and spoke quietly. "This doesn't feel like a survey project to you?" "Focus on the work," I told him. Not because I disagreed, because I'd learned a long time ago that curiosity in classified environments got you removed from projects. Or worse. The desert around us was beautiful in that harsh, unforgiving way that only New Mexico can achieve. Days were scorching, temperatures climbing past 100 degrees by noon. The sun beat down with an intensity that made the air shimmer, made distance impossible to judge, made shade feel like a gift from God. But the nights were something else entirely. Temperature would drop 40 degrees after sunset. The sky would explode with stars, so many stars that they stopped looking like individual points of light and started looking like clouds of luminescence spreading across infinity. The Milky Way so bright, you could read by it. I'd stand outside my trailer sometimes after dinner, staring up at that sky, and wonder what we were really doing here. The official story felt like tissue paper. Thin, transparent, something you'd tear right through if you pushed too hard. The official story was straightforward enough. We were conducting a geological survey to assess the stability of underground formations. The government was interested in potential storage facilities, the kind you'd use for hazardous materials or sensitive equipment. Nothing unusual. These kinds of surveys happened all the time across the Southwest. Abandoned mines, natural caverns, volcanic tubes. The region was full of them, but certain details didn't add up. For one, the security was excessive. We had armed guards on 12-hour rotations, perimeter fences with motion sensors, a communications blackout that meant no personal phone calls, no mail, no contact with the outside world except through official channels. They told us it was standard protocol for projects near native land, that we needed to respect tribal sovereignty and minimize our footprint. Maybe that was partially true. But it didn't explain the infrared cameras. It didn't explain why our badges had biometric scanners. It didn't explain the 2 helicopters that landed every Thursday at exactly 2100 hours, delivering personnel who never stayed more than 36 hours. The drilling started on day 9. We'd identified a promising site beneath Archuleta Mesa, a prominent geological feature that dominated the landscape. The mesa rose nearly 9,000 feet above sea level, a massive sandstone formation that had been sacred to the Jicarilla Apache for generations. Our seismic surveys indicated extensive cave systems beneath the surface, natural formations that could potentially be expanded and reinforced. The drill rig arrived on a Wednesday, transported in pieces on 3 flatbed trucks. It took 2 days to assemble, a derrick 70 feet tall, diesel engine powerful enough to punch through limestone like butter. The sound of it starting up for the first time echoed across the valley, a deep mechanical roar that sent birds scattering from their nests miles away. We worked in shifts around the clock. The bit descended inch by inch, foot by foot, pulling up core samples that we labeled, cataloged, and sealed in containers that were immediately transported off-site. I watched those samples leave, marked with codes I didn't recognize, destined for analysis facilities I wasn't cleared to know about. Another detail that didn't quite fit the official story. Standard geological surveys don't usually require that level of security. By day 14, we'd reached depth, 680 feet. The bit broke through into open space around midnight on a Saturday. I wasn't on shift, but the change in sound woke me, that sudden absence of resistance, the engine RPMs jumping as the drill spun freely for a moment before they killed it. I was out of my bunk and dressed before the PA system crackled to life. Primary descent team to equipment trailer 1, immediately. I was part of the initial descent team. My job was to assess structural integrity, identify potential engineering challenges, and determine what kind of support framework we'd need if we proceeded to the excavation phase. Standard stuff. I'd done similar work a dozen times in Nevada, Arizona, and Utah, but my hands were shaking as I geared up. That violation of routine, that PA announcement in the middle of the night, something about it felt different, urgent, important. 4 of us rode a crude elevator platform that descended through the vertical shaft we'd drilled over the previous week. Me, Frank, a geologist named Dr. Sarah Chen, and a security contractor called Briggs, who never spoke unless directly addressed. The platform was basically a reinforced metal cage suspended by steel cables, controlled by a winch operator on the surface. No rails, no safety walls, just open air and the sound of those cables groaning under our weight. The shaft was narrow, barely 6 feet in diameter, and the descent felt endless. I watched the sunlight fade above us, that perfect circle of blue sky growing smaller and smaller, replaced by the harsh glow of our work lights bouncing off limestone walls. The rock around us changed as we descended. Top layers were younger sedimentary formations, sandstone, shale, soft enough that the drill bit had chewed through them efficiently. But deeper down, we hit older stone, limestone, volcanic rock, layers that spoke of ancient seas and violent geological events millions of years in the past. The temperature dropped noticeably as we descended. Started at maybe 90 degrees at the surface, typical for a New Mexico afternoon. By the time we reached 400 feet, I needed my jacket. At 600 feet, my breath was visible in the thin beam of my flashlight. Dr. Chen checked her instruments, called readings up to the surface team. Temperature, humidity, atmospheric pressure, gas concentrations. All normal, all within expected parameters for a sealed cave system. Except for the temperature. That didn't make sense. We should have been getting warmer as we descended, not colder. Thermal anomaly, Dr. Chen muttered, more to herself than to us. She scribbled notes in a waterproof notebook. Possible underground water flow, or... She stopped, frowned at her readings, shook her head. Or what? I asked. Or nothing. Just unusual. She didn't meet my eyes. The platform settled onto solid ground with a metallic clang that echoed far longer than it should have. Frank unclipped his safety line and stepped off first, shining his light into the darkness around us. The beam didn't travel far before it was swallowed by shadow. We'd broken through into the edge of something vast. Radio check, Frank called into his headset. Surface, do you copy? Static. Then a voice, tinny and distant through the interference of 600 feet of rock. Copy, descent team, 5 by 5. We've reached the cavity, beginning initial survey. The cavern we entered was massive, not huge by the standards of commercial cave systems. Places like Carlsbad or Mammoth Cave would have dwarfed it. But for a previously unknown formation, it was significant. Our lights couldn't reach the ceiling. The space opened up around us like a cathedral carved by water and time, stalactites hanging like frozen chandeliers, stalagmites rising from the floor in strange, organic shapes. Beautiful, ancient, and according to our instruments, extending at least 200 feet in multiple directions. But something felt wrong immediately. I can't explain it better than that. Some primitive part of my brain, the part that kept our ancestors alive on the savannah by recognizing when predators were nearby, was screaming at me to leave. The air was too still, too cold. When I spoke, my voice didn't echo the way it should have in a space that size. It was as if the darkness swallowed sound before it could travel. The acoustics were wrong. Everything was wrong. Dr. Chen felt it too. I could tell from the way she moved, careful, hesitant, like a deer testing the wind for danger. Briggs had his hand on his sidearm, which was ridiculous. What was he going to shoot down here? But the gesture spoke volumes about his instincts. Only Frank seemed unfazed. He moved with purpose, directing us to spread out, establish a perimeter, begin taking measurements and samples. Professional, clinical, as if we were surveying an empty warehouse instead of a void that had been sealed beneath the earth for longer than human civilization. Temperature reading? Frank's voice crackled through our radio system. He was monitoring us from... No, wait, he was here with us. The voice on the radio was someone else. Someone on the surface copying our communications in real time. 42 degrees, I reported, checking my gauge. Humidity at 85%. Air quality reads normal, but there's... I paused, trying to articulate what my instincts were screaming. There's something off about the acoustics down here. Note it in your log, the surface voice responded. Continue the survey. We spent the next 4 hours mapping the cavern system. What we found was remarkable from a geological standpoint. The natural formations were more extensive than our seismic data had suggested. Multiple chambers connected by narrow passages. Some spaces were small, barely large enough to crawl through, requiring us to remove our gear and squeeze through gaps in the stone. Others opened into vaulted rooms that could have housed aircraft. The geology was complex, layers of limestone and sandstone interspersed with volcanic rock that suggested ancient seismic activity. I documented everything with photographs and notes, the way water had carved channels through softer stone, the mineral deposits that painted the walls in shades of rust and copper and pale green, the formations that had taken millennia to develop, one drop of mineral-rich water at a time. Beautiful, scientifically fascinating, and completely inadequate to explain the feeling of wrongness that intensified with every passing hour. It was Dr. Chen who found the first anomaly. She'd been taking samples from a wall in the second chamber when she noticed something, a regularity to certain formations, a pattern that repeated with mathematical precision. Natural processes don't work that way. Nature loves chaos, loves variation. But these formations were too regular, too intentional. "Come look at this," she called. I made my way over, careful with my footing on the uneven floor. She was pointing at a section of wall maybe 10 feet across and 8 feet high. At first glance, it looked like any other limestone surface. But when you focused on it, when you really looked, you could see what had caught her attention. The texture wasn't random. It flowed in specific directions, following lines that curved and intersected with geometric precision. "Erosion pattern?" I suggested, knowing even as I said it that it wasn't right. "Erosion doesn't do that." She traced one of the lines with her finger. "Erosion follows paths of least resistance. It's almost like..." "Like what?" She pulled back, shaking her head. "I don't know, but it's not natural." We documented it. Photographs, measurements, samples carefully extracted and sealed. Frank called it in to the surface team. We moved on to the next chamber. That's when we found the wall. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that I was seeing patterns in the rock formations that weren't really there. But when I moved closer, there was no mistaking it. The wall wasn't natural. It was too smooth, too regular. And when I shined my light directly on the surface, I could see marks, faint impressions that looked almost like symbols or characters, though unlike any alphabet I'd ever encountered. "Frank, you need to see this," I called into my radio. Static. Then his voice, clipped and cautious. "Describe what you're seeing." "There's a wall here, artificial. I ran my hand across the surface, cold, slightly metallic. "It's not natural rock. Someone built this. Hold your position." The next 20 minutes felt like hours. My 3 teammates gathered around me, their lights illuminating the structure from different angles. None of us spoke. We didn't need to. We were all thinking the same thing. This cavern system wasn't just a natural formation. Someone had been here before. Someone had built something beneath Archuleta Mesa. And based on the weathering patterns on that wall, they'd built it a very long time ago. When Frank finally reached us, he wasn't alone. Two men in dark suits accompanied him, both wearing respirators despite our air quality readings showing no contamination. They didn't introduce themselves. They moved straight to the wall, one of them pulling out some kind of scanning device I didn't recognize from any equipment catalog I'd ever seen. "Everyone topside," Frank ordered. "Now!" "But the survey isn't," I started. "Now, Carlson." His tone left no room for argument. We ascended in silence. Back at the surface, the sun felt too bright, too warm. I'd only been underground for 4 hours, but it felt like days. The disconnect was jarring. Above ground, the world was normal. Clear skies, distant mountains, the smell of desert sage. Below ground, something impossible was waiting. They kept us in the mess hall for the next 6 hours. No one was allowed to leave, no communication with the outside. Finally, as the sun was setting, Frank gathered our small team of 4 in a separate trailer. This time, the 2 men in suits were there, along with someone new, a woman with silver hair and a military bearing that made me instantly revise my guess about her civilian status. "What you saw today remains classified," she began without preamble. "You will not discuss it with anyone outside this room. You will not reference it in any reports. You will not mention it in your personal logs or diaries. You will not speak of it to your families, your friends, or your colleagues. Is that understood?" We nodded. What else could we do? "The structure you encountered is of interest to multiple government agencies," she continued. "Its origin, purpose, and composition are currently under investigation. You were not supposed to find it. Its existence does not align with our preliminary surveys." That was the first lie. I knew it then, though I couldn't have said how. But I'd been doing this work long enough to recognize when someone was reading from a script, when the official story had been prepared in advance. This woman had known about that wall. She'd known exactly what we would find, which meant someone else had been down there before us, which meant this entire project wasn't what they'd told us it was. "Effective immediately, this site is under military jurisdiction," she said. "Your contracts are terminated. You'll receive full compensation for the agreed-upon duration, plus a substantial completion bonus. In exchange, you will sign additional non-disclosure agreements and submit to a security debriefing. Any violation of these terms will result in federal prosecution under national security statutes. Are there any questions?" I raised my hand, old habit from 8 years of military service. "Ma'am, can you tell us what that structure is?" She looked at me for a long moment. Her eyes were gray, cold, analytical. "No. We were off-site by midnight, driven to Albuquerque in a windowless van, processed through a facility that had no signage, and released with cashier's checks and signed forms. The entire experience had a dreamlike quality, as if it had happened to someone else. But the memory of that wall stayed vivid. The smoothness of it, the cold, those strange marks that might have been symbols or might have been nothing at all. I tried to put it behind me, found new contract work, moved to Texas, got married, built a life that had nothing to do with classified projects or underground structures or walls that shouldn't exist. For 3 years, I almost succeeded in forgetting. Then, Paul Benowitz started talking. I didn't know him personally, but word travels fast in certain circles, especially among contractors who work classified projects. Benowitz was an electronics engineer in Albuquerque, smart guy, legitimate credentials. Ran a company called Thunder Scientific that manufactured high-altitude testing equipment. Not some crackpot in his garage, a real professional with real skills. He claimed he'd intercepted strange radio signals near Kirtland Air Force Base, claimed he'd tracked them to a source beneath Archuleta Mesa, claimed there was an underground facility there, a joint operation between the government and extraterrestrial beings conducting biological experiments. At first I dismissed it as paranoia, The kind of conspiracy theory that attracted people who wanted to believe in something extraordinary. New Mexico had a long history of UFO stories. Roswell was less than 300 miles away, still part of local legend decades after the supposed crash. But then I started noticing patterns in how Benowitz's story evolved. Patterns that made my skin crawl with recognition. It worked like this. Benowitz would make a claim, specific, detailed, to technical. He'd say he'd intercepted a certain frequency, photographed certain lights, documented certain patterns, and then, within weeks, someone would feed him information that confirmed and expanded on that claim. Documents would appear, photographs, eyewitness accounts from anonymous sources who claimed to have worked at the facility, who described multiple levels underground, who provided technical specifications that sounded just plausible enough to be credible. Each piece of evidence more elaborate than the last. Each piece pushing Benowitz further down a rabbit hole he couldn't escape. I watched it happen in real time through underground newsletters and meetings of contractors who'd worked sensitive projects. The story grew more baroque with each iteration. Level 1 was security and communications. Level 2 was military quarters. Level 3 was corporate offices for private defense contractors. Level 4 was where the experimentation began. Human volunteers subjected to medical procedures. Level 5 was genetic manipulation. Level 6 was hybrid creatures being developed in laboratories. Level 7, the deepest level, was where the aliens themselves resided. Great the aliens with large eyes and thin bodies, reptilian aliens that resembled bipedal lizards. A whole menagerie of extraterrestrial species conducting experiments with tacit government approval. It was masterful. Whoever was running the operation understood exactly how to manipulate someone like Benowitz, give him just enough truth to make the lies believable, feed his paranoia, encourage his investigation, and then watch as he discredited himself by making increasingly wild claims that nobody could verify. Because here's the thing, some of what Benowitz said was probably true. The underground facility beneath Archuleta Mesa existed. I'd been there. I'd seen evidence of construction. I'd touched that impossible wall. But bury that truth under enough science fiction, enough alien conspiracies, enough implausible details, and nobody would take any of it seriously. The truth becomes indistinguishable from fantasy. The signal gets lost in the noise. I recognized the pattern because I'd seen it before during my Army years. Psychological operations, disinformation campaigns. The intelligence community called it gray propaganda. Information that might be true, might be false, and was deliberately designed to confuse and mislead. You didn't just deny the truth, you didn't just lie. You made the truth so ridiculous, so associated with obvious fiction, that anyone who tried to investigate it would be dismissed as a crank. The technique was elegant in its cruelty. Benowitz wasn't just being discredited, he was being weaponized against his own investigation. By 1983, Benowitz was appearing at UFO conferences, giving detailed presentations about the Dulce facility. He had diagrams. He had technical specifications. He claimed to have video footage of alien craft entering and exiting the mesa through hidden doors. He described the genetic experiments in gruesome detail, humans being subjected to horrific procedures, body parts being harvested, hybrid creatures kept in cages like laboratory animals. The presentations were compelling if you wanted to believe, terrifying if you actually did believe. And that's when I knew. That's when I understood what they were doing to him. Because some of those details, the ones about underground construction, about sealed chambers, about structures that shouldn't exist, those weren't coming from Benowitz's imagination. Someone was feeding him information, someone with actual knowledge of the site, but they were mixing truth with fiction in a cocktail so toxic that nobody could parse what was real anymore. I wanted to contact him, wanted to tell him he was being manipulated, wanted to warn him that the people feeding him information weren't allies trying to expose the truth. They were intelligence operatives burying the truth under layers of science fiction. But I couldn't. I'd signed those non-disclosure agreements. I had a wife and daughter to protect. And honestly, part of me wondered if reaching out would make things worse. If it would draw attention to me. If it would make me a target the same way Benowitz had become a target. So I watched from a distance as Benowitz's mental health deteriorated. The paranoia grew worse. He started seeing surveillance everywhere. Started believing his phone was tapped, his house was being watched, his life was in danger. And maybe some of that was true. Maybe they were watching him. But they'd also created a situation where his legitimate concerns became indistinguishable from clinical paranoia. By the mid-'80s, Benowitz was hospitalized. By the '90s, he'd withdrawn from public life entirely. His credibility destroyed. His investigation ended, his warnings ignored. But here's what kept me awake at night, what still keeps me awake. The wall I'd seen beneath Archuleta Mesa was real. That wasn't paranoia or delusion or misidentification. I'd touched it. I'd photographed it. I'd filed reports about it. So if the government was running a disinformation campaign to make everyone believe in alien bases and genetic experiments, what were they really hiding? What was so important that they'd rather have people believe in science fiction than discover the truth? The answer came slowly, piece by piece, through my own investigation that I conducted with the paranoid caution Benowitz should have used, but couldn't. I started my own investigation. Quiet, careful. Nothing that would trigger the attention of whoever was monitoring Benowitz, nothing that would put me on any watch lists. I didn't contact Benowitz or any of the UFO researchers who'd become obsessed with Dulce. I focused on the mundane details: construction contracts, geological surveys, land use records, environmental impact statements. The kind of paper trail that bored people into not looking too closely. The kind of documents that were technically public but buried in file cabinets in county offices that nobody visited anymore. I took vacation time and drove across New Mexico, stopping at courthouses and Bureau of Land Management offices, requesting files on geological surveys from the mid-'70s to early '80s. Most clerks barely looked up from their desks. A few asked why I needed such old records. I told them I was researching historical mining operations for a book. Nobody questioned it. Nobody seemed to care. And what I found was a pattern. Between 1976 and 1982, there were 7 different geological survey projects in northern New Mexico. 7 separate sites, all within a 200-mile radius. All of them near native land, Jicarilla Apache, Navajo, several pueblos. All of them conducted by different civilian contractors, though when I dug deeper, many of those contractors shared board members or funding sources. All of them classified under various pretexts: cultural sensitivity, environmental protection, national security. And all of them terminated abruptly with minimal documentation. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. They were searching for something, and they were finding it. One of those contractors had been working near Chaco Canyon in '77. Chaco was already a significant archaeological site. Massive pueblo structures built by ancestral Puebloans between 900 and 1200 AD. But this contractor had been surveying underground, mapping cave systems that extended beneath the main ruins. Their team had found petroglyphs in an underground chamber, ancient symbols carved into stone, the kind of rock art that ancestral Puebloans were known for. Spiral patterns, geometric designs, handprints. But here's what made it impossible. The symbols were inside a sealed chamber that, according to the geological dating, had been sealed by natural cave-ins approximately 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years. Ancestral Puebloans hadn't emerged as a distinct culture until maybe 2,000 years ago at the earliest, which meant either the geological dating was catastrophically wrong, unlikely given they'd used multiple independent methods, or someone had carved those symbols inside a chamber before it was sealed. Someone who existed 6,000 years before the culture we credited with creating that style of rock art. The official report from that survey team was frustratingly vague. They noted the presence of petroglyphs. They documented the sealed nature of the chamber. They made no attempt to explain the chronological impossibility. Instead, they terminated the survey, citing structural instability, and sealed the access tunnel. When I tried to contact members of that survey team, I found that 2 had died in the intervening years. 1 had emigrated to Australia, and the 4th simply refused to speak to me. Another contractor had been surveying caves in the Jemez Mountains in '78. The Jemez are volcanic, part of the Valles caldera, a massive supervolcano that last erupted over 1 million years ago. The survey was supposedly looking for geothermal energy potential, mapping hot springs and steam vents that could be harnessed for power generation. Standard stuff for the late '70s, when energy crises were driving alternative power research. But what they found were metallic fragments embedded in limestone formations inside one of the caves. Not surface contamination, not modern debris that had washed or fallen into the cave system. These fragments were embedded in the stone itself, fused with limestone that, according to radiometric dating, was approximately 13 million years old. 13 million years, long before humans, before hominids, before anything remotely resembling intelligent life on this planet, according to conventional evolutionary timelines. The fragments were small, the largest maybe 3 inches across, most smaller than a dime. But when the survey team extracted samples and sent them for analysis, the results were disturbing. The metal showed evidence of machine tooling, not crude tools, precision machining. Geometric regularity that only occurs through deliberate industrial processes. And the composition was unusual, primarily titanium with trace elements of metals that shouldn't naturally occur together. I found a copy of that analysis report in a file box in an Albuquerque storage facility. It had been misfiled under a different project code, which is probably why it hadn't been destroyed like I'm sure someone intended. The report was technical, written in the dry language scientists use when they're documenting something that shouldn't exist. But between the lines, you could read their confusion, their inability to explain what they'd found, their awareness that they were looking at evidence of technology and geological strata that predated human existence by millions of years. The official conclusion was contamination, modern material that had somehow been introduced to the cave system and had bonded with the limestone through some unspecified chemical process. Never mind that such a process would require conditions that didn't exist in those caves. Never mind that the titanium fragments showed wear patterns consistent with use, with function, with purpose. Contamination was the only explanation that allowed the universe to make sense. So contamination it was. That survey was terminated within 6 weeks of the discovery. The cave entrance was sealed with concrete. The area was declared unstable and off-limits. The contractors were paid out and sent home with non-disclosure agreements that made mine look permissive by comparison. There were similar stories at all 7 sites. Strange symbols in sealed chambers, structural anomalies that suggested construction rather than natural formation. Materials that shouldn't exist in the geological contexts where they were found. And in every case, the same pattern: discovery, documentation, classification, termination, denial. The pattern was clear. They weren't looking for storage facilities. They weren't surveying for geothermal energy or mineral deposits or any of the official reasons listed in the public contracts. They were looking for something else, something that had been hidden or lost or forgotten, something that left evidence scattered across northern New Mexico in a pattern that suggested, what? Migration? A network of sites? The remains of a civilization that existed before recorded history? That wall beneath Archuleta Mesa wasn't an anomaly. It was one example of something larger. One piece of a puzzle that stretched across the Southwest, buried under millions of years of geological processes, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. And someone had asked. Multiple government agencies, working through civilian contractors, conducting surveys that looked routine but were searching for evidence of, I didn't even have words for it. Ancient human civilization? Pre-human intelligence? Evidence that challenged everything we thought we knew about the timeline of technological development on this planet? The scope of it made my head spin. This wasn't a cover-up of one incident, one crashed aircraft, one unexplained phenomenon. This was systematic research into findings that couldn't be explained within the existing framework of human history. And rather than announce those findings, rather than revolutionize our understanding of the past, someone had decided the public couldn't handle the truth, or shouldn't handle it, or wouldn't handle it in ways that benefited whoever was making that decision. I know how this sounds. I know what you're thinking. This is exactly the kind of conspiracy theory that rational people dismiss. Ancient advanced civilizations, hidden government programs. It's the stuff of late-night cable shows and internet forums. But I touched that wall. I saw those symbols. I held fragments of metal that had been analyzed by multiple independent labs and produced impossible results. The evidence existed. The question wasn't whether it was real. The question was what it meant. In 1984, I received a visit. Two men in suits, different from the ones I'd encountered in '79, but with the same institutional authority. They didn't threaten me. They didn't need to. They simply reminded me of the non-disclosure agreements I'd signed. They mentioned my wife's name, my daughter's school, the details of my current contract work. They were polite, professional, and absolutely clear about the consequences of continuing my research. I stopped. What choice did I have? I had a family, I had a career, and I had no way to prove any of what I'd found. The documents I'd collected were fragmentary, the contracts were classified, the people I'd tried to interview had either disappeared or refused to speak to me. Without corroboration, I was just another paranoid veteran spinning stories about secret government projects. So I buried it, literally. Took all my files, all my photographs, all my notes, and sealed them in a waterproof container that I buried in my backyard in Houston. Insurance, I told myself. If something happened to me, someone might find them someday. Someone might ask the right questions. 46 years. That's how long I've carried this. Watched Benowitz deteriorate from the psychological warfare campaign waged against him. Watched the dull space legend grow into exactly the kind of science fiction nonsense that made serious investigation impossible. Watched people chase aliens in genetic experiments, while the real mystery remained buried beneath Archuleta Mesa. Because here's what I believe, after 4 decades of thinking about this. That wall wasn't built by aliens. Those symbols weren't left by extraterrestrials. They were human, ancient, yes. Predating recorded history, yes. But human, evidence of a civilization or culture or society that existed before the ones we know about. Evidence that we're not the first advanced culture to emerge on this planet. Evidence that challenges everything we think we know about human history and technological development. And that's more threatening than aliens could ever be, because if you admit that there were advanced human civilizations before ours, you have to ask what happened to them. You have to ask if we're repeating their mistakes. You have to ask if we're as permanent and inevitable as we like to believe, or if we're just another cycle in a pattern that's played out before. The government didn't create a disinformation campaign to hide aliens. They created it to hide us, to hide evidence of our own past, to keep people focused on science fiction so they wouldn't look at the science fact. And it worked. For 50 years it's worked. But I'm 78 now. My wife passed 3 years ago after a long battle with cancer. My daughter lives in California with grandchildren I see twice a year if I'm lucky. The men who could prosecute me for breaking my non-disclosure agreement are dead or retired, or have moved on to other positions where 40-year-old secrets don't matter anymore. The agencies that ran those projects have been reorganized a dozen times, offices closed, files archived, institutional memory deliberately fragmented to prevent exactly the kind of connections I'd made. And I'm tired of carrying this alone, tired of waking up at 3 a.m. with that wall burned into my mind, tired of knowing something that feels important and being unable to share it. 3 weeks ago, I drove back to New Mexico. First time in 40 years. The journey itself was strange, retracing a route I'd taken in 1979, watching how the landscape had changed and hadn't changed. More development near Albuquerque, Santa Fe sprawling north. But once you got into the high desert, once you left the interstate behind, it was like traveling backward in time. The same endless sky, the same red rock formations, the same sense of space that makes you feel simultaneously insignificant and aware of your significance. Dulce hasn't changed much. Still small, still isolated, still beautiful in that stark desert way that either speaks to your soul or makes you desperate to leave. The town has maybe 3,000 people, mostly Jicarilla Apache. There's still no traffic light. Still that sense of being somewhere the modern world hasn't quite reached, where cell phone coverage is spotty and people still know their neighbors' names. The mesa still dominates the landscape. Archuleta Mesa rising like a monument to geological time, sandstone glowing orange and red in the late afternoon sun. I sat in my truck looking at it for maybe an hour, just looking, remembering what we'd found beneath it, remembering the wall, remembering how everything changed in that moment when I realized someone had built something impossible. I drove out to where our camp had been. Took me a while to find it. 40 years of weathering had erased most of the landmarks I remembered. But I finally recognized the terrain, the angle of the surrounding hills, the view of the mesa. The land has healed. No trace of the drilling operation, the trailers, the fences, the generators, the lights that ran all night. Nature reclaimed it all, the way nature does when humans finally leave things alone. Sagebrush growing where our mess hall stood. Grasses covering where we'd parked equipment. If you didn't know what to look for, you'd never guess that 40 people had lived and worked here for 2 months in the summer of '79. I hiked out to the coordinates I'd memorized. I'd written them down in '79, copied them into a notebook I kept hidden, checked them obsessively to make sure I hadn't misremembered. GPS made it easy to find the exact spot, though GPS hadn't existed when we'd been here originally. We'd navigated by compass and landmarks, by triangulation and dead reckoning. Now, I could walk straight to where that drill shaft had penetrated the earth. The hike took me 6 hours. I'm not 32 anymore. My knees complained with every step. My back ached. The altitude, nearly 7,000 feet, made breathing harder than I remembered. I had to stop frequently, rest, drink water, remind myself that I didn't need to prove anything to anyone. But I needed to see it again. Needed to know if I'd imagined it, if 40 years had turned memory into myth, if that wall was as impossible as I remembered, or if time had exaggerated its significance in my mind. I brought climbing equipment, rope, harness, carabiners, a helmet, lights, basic spelunking gear purchased from an outdoor store in Albuquerque, where the clerk had looked at me skeptically and asked if I was planning to go caving alone. I'd lied and said friends were meeting me. He'd still looked worried. 78-year-old men aren't supposed to go cave exploring. Hell, 78-year-old men aren't supposed to do a lot of things I was planning to do. I didn't expect to find anything. The shaft would be filled in. The caverns would be sealed. They wouldn't have left it accessible after terminating the project. Too much risk of someone stumbling onto it. Too much risk of locals finding it and asking questions. Standard protocol would be to pump concrete down the shaft, seal everything, erase all evidence of the drilling operation. That's what I would have done if I were running a classified project. But when I reached the coordinates, my heart almost stopped. There was a crack in the mesa. Not the drilled shaft, that was long gone, filled and probably covered with topsoil and vegetation. This was a natural fissure, a split in the sandstone, maybe 20 feet long, maybe 3 feet wide at its widest point. Recent. The edges were fresh, the rock inside unweathered. Probably opened during an earthquake. New Mexico gets them occasionally, small tremors that shift the landscape in subtle ways. Or maybe seasonal weathering, water seeping into cracks, freezing, expanding, slowly prying the rock apart over winters I hadn't witnessed. And it went down, deep. I shined my flashlight into the darkness and couldn't see the bottom. Couldn't see anything except shadows and rock disappearing into black. I spent 2 hours debating with myself. I'm not equipped for serious cave exploration anymore. My body isn't what it used to be. If I got injured down there, no one would find me. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Stupid. But I hadn't wanted to explain, hadn't wanted questions. I'd die in the dark beneath Archuleta Mesa, another mystery added to all the others. They'd find my truck eventually, parked out here in the middle of nowhere. They'd maybe search the area. But they wouldn't find me. Not if I fell. Not if I got wedged in a narrow passage. Not if the fissure collapsed and buried me alive. But I had to know. After 46 years of questions, I had to know if any of it was real or if I'd been chasing shadows. So I went down. Slowly. Carefully. Using techniques I hadn't practiced in decades, muscle memory returning gradually as I clipped into my rope, checked my knots, tested my anchor points. The fissure narrowed and widened, twisted and turned. Not a straight descent, more like following a crack that snaked through the rock at varying angles. Sometimes I was chimneying, pressing my back against one wall and my feet against the other, inching downward. Sometimes I was rappelling, feeding rope through my descender, trusting equipment I'd bought off Amazon to hold my weight. Sometimes the passage widened enough that I could almost stand, could catch my breath, could check my lights and my orientation. I descended maybe 80 feet before the fissure opened into a chamber. Not gradually. One moment I was in a crack barely wide enough for my shoulders, the next moment the walls fell away, and I was hanging in open space, my lights barely touching the walls on either side. I dropped the last few feet to the floor, landing harder than I intended, jarring my knees, reminding me again that I wasn't 32 anymore. The chamber was small compared to what we'd found in '79. Maybe 20 feet across, ceiling maybe 15 feet high. But it felt familiar. The same cold air, the same wrong acoustics, the same sense that I was somewhere I shouldn't be, somewhere that had been sealed for very good reasons. I explored carefully, mapping the chamber in my head, looking for passages that might connect to the larger system. Found 2 narrow gaps that might lead somewhere, but both required crawling, and I wasn't ready for that yet. So I moved systematically around the perimeter, checking walls, documenting with my camera, trying to understand how this chamber related to the ones I'd explored 40 years ago. Not the same chamber I'd explored in '79, but connected to it. I could feel it in the quality of the air, the way sound moved, the cold that penetrated my jacket despite the insulation. This was part of the same system. The same ancient network of caves that honeycombed beneath Archuleta Mesa. It took me an hour to work up the courage to try the crawl passages. The first one dead-ended after about 15 feet. The second one continued, narrowing and widening, requiring me to remove my pack and push it ahead of me, squirming through gaps that scraped my shoulders and made my heart race with claustrophobic panic. But then it opened, into a second chamber, smaller than the first, and then a third passage, and then a third chamber. I found the wall in that third chamber, different location from '79, but the same construction. That same impossibly smooth surface, that same cold that had nothing to do with air temperature and everything to do with something fundamentally wrong about the material itself. And those symbols, carved or impressed or somehow integrated into the material itself, following patterns that suggested meaning even though I had no context to understand them. I touched it again. 40 years later, and it felt exactly the same. Cold, slightly metallic. Neither stone nor metal nor anything I could identify. I ran my fingers over the symbols, feeling faint depressions that were too regular to be natural, too precise to be random. Someone had made this. Someone had stood where I was standing, however many thousands or millions of years ago, and had created this structure for purposes I couldn't begin to understand. I took photographs, hundreds of them, different angles, different lighting, close-ups of individual symbols, wide shots showing the entire wall, detail shots showing the texture and the way limestone had grown over parts of it. Evidence that would survive if I didn't. Evidence that could be analyzed, enhanced, studied by people with more expertise than I possessed. Evidence that might finally answer some of the questions that had haunted me for 40 years. But I found something else too. Something I wasn't expecting. Something that made my blood run cold. Recent activity. Fresh drill marks in the ceiling of the third chamber, barely visible but unmistakable once I shined my light directly on them. New equipment caches tucked into alcoves, sealed in plastic containers with military markings I recognized from my army days. Battery packs, sensors, communications equipment. Some of it looked like standard survey gear. Some of it I didn't recognize at all. Devices with no obvious purpose, covered in warning labels in multiple languages. Someone has been back, multiple times, recently. This isn't ancient history. This is ongoing. I checked dates on the equipment, found service tags that suggested the most recent maintenance was within the last 6 months. 6 months. While the world forgot about Dulce, while the conspiracy theories grew more ridiculous, while serious researchers dismissed the entire legend as nonsense, someone was still here, still investigating, still researching whatever secrets these chambers held. Which means I was right. They didn't abandon this. They just took it deeper underground, figuratively and literally. Whatever they're researching, whatever they're investigating, it's still happening. And they've gotten better at hiding it, better at the disinformation, better at making sure curious contractors like me don't stumble into things they shouldn't see. I'm sharing this now because I need someone else to know. I've uploaded all my photographs to a secure server. I've included coordinates, dates, and every piece of documentation I still have from the original project. If you're watching this, you have access to the same information I do. You can investigate. You can ask questions. You can demand answers. I don't know what we'll find. I don't know if the truth will be as extraordinary as the lies they've told to cover it up. But I know we deserve to know. We deserve to understand our own history, even if it challenges everything we thought we knew. Especially if it challenges everything we thought we knew. The wall beneath Archuleta Mesa is real. The symbols are real. The evidence of ancient advanced human civilization is real. What we choose to do with that evidence is up to us. But silence won't protect us anymore. Silence has never protected anyone, except those who benefit from our ignorance. My name is David Carlson. This is my testimony. And I'm done being silent. What do you think happened beneath Archuleta Mesa? What do you think that wall represents? Have you encountered anything similar in your own experiences? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we bring you a new story from military veterans every single day. Stories of courage, mystery, and truth. Hit that like button if this story resonated with you and share it with someone who needs to hear it. The truth deserves to be told. The question is, are we ready to listen? Tomorrow, we'll be back with another story you won't find anywhere else. Until then, stay curious, stay questioning, and remember that the deepest truths are often buried where we're told not to look.